Hey everyone, Eric here. Very quickly before we get to our discussion today with Paul Nantulya, I just want to give you a quick heads up that we've made it even easier to try out the China Africa email newsletter that Cobus and I produce every day. It's something that we're super proud of and we'd love for you to give it a try. $3 for 3 months and you'll get the newsletter delivered every day plus full access to all of the exclusive analysis on the CAP website. If you're following Chinese foreign policy, the Belt and Road, African politics, Chinese tech, and so much more along those lines, well, this newsletter is perfect for you. Sign up today at chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe. Once again, that's just $3 for 3 months at chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, we're going to pick up the theme of the past few weeks of our podcast where we're trying to understand the moment that we're in. So earlier this week, we had a discussion with Alonso Soto from Bloomberg about debt relief and where we are now. Today, we're going to be talking about soft power. And this has been one of the themes of our podcast dating back years now about the Chinese presence in Africa in terms of how it's communicating its ideals, how it's persuading people to do things. And really in this day and age now of the U.S.-China standoff, the idea of soft power is even more important as there is a competition of ideas that's still out there. One area in particular that I've been writing a lot about lately is in Nigeria. And Nigeria in so many ways represents an interesting case study for what's happening in other parts of the continent. Let me take you back to a few of the bullet points from earlier this year. So a lot of things started to happen in April, if you'll recall. About mid-April, around April 12th, April 13th, when those images started to appear on Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp of Nigerians and other black residents in Guangzhou who were being discriminated against for any number of different reasons, but it really set off a firestorm. Then that was followed up a few weeks later by a fiasco that was surrounding Chinese doctors that were being sent to Nigeria at that point by CCECC, which is the big state-owned engineering and construction company. The Nigerian medical community passionately objected to that, and really it caused a 3 to 4 week furor, followed by Benjamin Kalu, a representative in the Nigerian House of Representatives in the National Assembly. He then called for every Chinese national to have their immigration papers and every Chinese business in Nigeria to be checked. He said that in response to what happened in Guangzhou. 2 weeks later, one of his colleagues, another opposition politician, Representative Ben Igbakba, also in the House of Representatives, called for an audit of the past 20 years of Chinese loans in Nigeria. Now, at the same time that all of this was happening in Abuja, these joint task force across the country in Nigeria started deploying heavily armed troops or security forces out to start cracking down on illegal mining. And throughout all of this, particularly in Osun State and some of these others, there were dozens of Chinese who were arrested and nabbed and picked up in all of this. There have also been a number of high-profile allegations of Chinese factories in Nigeria abusing their local workers. And now for the past 3 weeks, the country's been embroiled in just a spectacular controversy over Chinese loans that just won't go away. Now, what makes this interesting is that we've basically had a steady stream of bad news going back all the way to April, uninterrupted. And from the beginning, we have barely heard a peep from the Chinese embassy or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing. Nothing. I mean, from time to time, they'll put a tweet out or they'll put a statement out, but there is no messaging that's going to countervail any of these events that have happened over the past few months. So in this vacuum, all of this negative media coverage appears to be having a rather significant impact on civil society perceptions of China that are becoming increasingly and decidedly negative. So, Cobus, this has got me thinking a lot about Chinese soft power. And when we talk about soft power, we usually think of CGTN, the TV network, Xinhua, the news agency, Star Times, and things like that. But it feels like we're not necessarily reading it the same way based on what we've seen in Nigeria. What do you think?
With soft power, soft power is a notoriously slippery concept, and it plays in a few different kind of spaces at once. One of them is at the very high level. So obviously soft power is frequently seen, or I think Joseph Nye classically coined it, as essentially getting other people to do what you want them to do without threatening them or making them do it, through military or economic pressure. Like essentially getting people on the same page as you so that they then do work with you in the wider world. And at the very high level, I think Chinese soft power seems pretty healthy in Africa. As we've seen, African states tend to vote with China in the UN, even on issues that would seem to be against their specific interests, like, for example, Islamic, African countries voting with China or supporting China on issues like Xinjiang. So their soft power seems to be working okay, but there's a different kind of soft power, which is a kind of a wider kind of popular perception of your country, and like whether your country has values that fit in with the thinking of the local population. And there we're seeing a lot of these kind of like negative ideas about China. And the question then becomes how and whether that really affects Chinese soft power on the continent.
Okay, well, you brought up two interesting points here. Let's first start with Joseph Nye himself. I think for the purposes of our discussion on soft power today, it's really important for us to have a benchmark. And you referenced Joseph Nye. He introduced the concept dating back to the late 80s, early 90s. He's a Harvard professor, and he wrote a book called Bound to Lead: The Changing Nature of American Power. And at that time, he introduced the concept of soft power. Let's listen to his definition of it, and then we'll come back to, I want to challenge one of the comments that you made, Cobus.
Well, power is the ability to get what you want from others, and you can do it three ways. You can do it with coercion, you can do it with payment, or you can do it with attraction and persuasion. Coercion and payment I call hard power. The ability to get what you want through attraction and persuasion is soft power. Well, probably the greatest example would be the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall went down, it did not go down under artillery barrage of hard power. It went down under people wielding hammers and bulldozers. In other words, their minds had been changed. They've been attracted and persuaded. And that's an example of soft power. And that was created by culture, values, ideas. People on the eastern side had lost their faith in communism. And they basically were changed, or those views were changed through attraction and persuasion. And that's a good example of soft power as you could want.
Coercion versus attraction and persuasion. And Cobus, I just wanted to pick up on what you said about the UN votes, for example, from African countries. And I'm wondering if those are done by coercion or persuasion. That is, they're voting because the risk of not supporting China could launch countermeasures, or there could be consequences to it. So that might not actually be an effect of soft power, but actual hard power in the Joseph Nye definition.
It might well be, but this is one of the problems with the concept of soft power itself, because there's a kind of a fuzzy space there in between actual coercion and attraction, in the sense that many ruling elites feel themselves on the same page with other ruling elites. So it's possible to have a sympathetic ear for your point as a kind of a powerful state like China, from African ruling elites without having to coerce them, without having to threaten, to like trade impacts. And the thing of course is we don't know what the discussion was in this case, but it's attraction of a small ruling elite and attraction of a large Republic. Those are two different things, but they kind of both fit into the soft power concept, which is one of the reasons why the soft power concept is frequently seen as problematic. It's kind of too elastic in lots of cases.
Let's get some arbitration on this, and we really could not have a better expert on this. Paul Nantulya is a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. He has an extensive background in African security issues, both as a scholar and as an active participant on the ground in a number of post-conflict environments. He's got too long of a profile for me to read, but there are a couple points that I did want to bring out. He was a regional technical advisor on South Sudan for Catholic Relief Services, and he was also part of the Accord team that worked directly with President Nelson Mandela in South Africa on the Arusha peace process in Burundi. Paul, it is a true honor to have you on the show for the first time, long overdue, and a very good morning to you from Washington, D.C.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eric. I'm glad to be here.
So you heard a little bit of the debate that Cobus and I are having about the moment that we're in right now vis-a-vis Chinese soft power in Africa. We're going to get into some of the more technical definitions and the details of it later in our discussion. You've given us a lot of good talking points to pursue. But I'd like to start our discussion a little bit of help me figure out this confusion that I have about where we are, not just in Nigeria, but in Africa as a whole, in terms of China's effectiveness in soft power and where we are in the moment.
Yes, no, thanks. No, as Cobus said, it's a very elastic concept. And so it's very difficult because, with soft power, you're really dealing with intangible factors that are very, very difficult to measure. And if you venture into measuring the effectiveness of soft power, or the lack of effectiveness of soft power, you're going to have to look at it from a long-term perspective because it essentially involves attitudes. Cobus was talking about attraction. He was talking about appeal. And this is extremely interesting because if you look at the Chinese theory of soft power, which goes way back to the dynastic era, these are the three terms that are used frequently by Confucian scholars and others who were advising the emperors at the time. They were basically talking about attraction or attraction capacity. They were talking about appealing power, and they were talking about cultural power. Now, these are Chinese concepts, and they are built around the idea that China had always had something special and something different and something unique to offer the world around it in terms of the superiority of its culture, the superiority of its governance models, and its way of life. And this is a long-standing Chinese tradition. And sort of if you look at what has happened in the contemporary era, the Chinese Communist Party has pretty much embraced the idea of soft power. In fact, a lot of scholars will argue that the Chinese are the best students of Joseph Nye because they really poured into his theories of soft power, particularly Bound to Lead, which was translated and critiqued by the Chinese military, specifically by the People's Liberation Army military press that unpacked his concept, critiqued it, and then developed a response to it. And we see that response being highly instrumentalized in the policy process. So pretty much every national congress that the Communist Party has held from the Hu Jintao era up to the Xi Jinping era has had a session, has had sessions on soft power. And so the idea has been unpacked. It has been embraced by the Chinese leadership. And it's very interesting because if you look at the lineup of the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest decision-making body in China, you've got two soft power theorists in there. So that just comes to show the political relevance of soft power in terms of how the Chinese believe their country should be engaging, especially the developing world and the countries of Africa.
Do you have a kind of a clear idea of how the concept has evolved over, from the Hu Jintao era to the Xi Jinping era, and what roles initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative is playing in it now?
Yes, I mean, the Belt and Road is definitely, if you look at how it's being reported, these terms, again, attraction, appeal, are very much used in Belt and Road communications. If you go back to the Second Belt and Road Forum that was held last year, and you look at Xi Jinping's speech, and you look at the speeches that were made by different officials in China, including Wang Yi and Yang Jieshi, who was then the architect, essentially the foreign policy chief. It's been framed as a soft power concept, as a soft power tool, as a soft power export. And I think there is a calculative and instrumentalist approach there, because the Belt and Road has received a lot of pushback, particularly over issues of debt, over issues of security, as well as the use of Chinese security contractors to secure some of these state-owned enterprises, and that has come with its problems. So the government has really doubled down on this concept and really tried to convey a series of narratives. China is not going to throw its weight around. China is not going to behave, quote unquote, like the hegemonists do. China is going to try and stay true to its position and its image as a true friend of the African continent, which contributed to the liberation of quite a number of African countries, and so on and so forth. So these are strategic narratives that we see being conveyed at different levels of the Chinese government. So, the one way to look at it is altruistic. However, there's a very, very calculative and very instrumentalist approach, in the sense that, the Chinese government wants to do everything that it possibly can to downplay the geostrategic, and the hard military elements of its engagements on the African continent. So that's really where the soft power debate comes in. And the other thing that I would say is that I tend to disagree with the notion that the Chinese, authorities, because I think we need to distinguish between the Chinese authorities and the Chinese people here. That the Chinese authorities were excellent students of Joseph Nye, because if you look at the translation that I was talking about, the translation of Joseph Nye's work in China, it's actually titled, "Will America Be Able to Lead the World Once and for All?" And the conclusion that it made was that Joseph Nye had developed a theory that could be used as a strategic weapon by the Americans and the West in general to subvert China and overthrow its ruling party. And I think that is the message they took away from Bound to Lead. And so when they developed their theory of soft power, which of course they tried to ground in Chinese history, it was really developed as a critique, as a criticism of Joseph Nye's work. And so obviously, that meant that they had to do everything that they could within their own thinking to try and prevent the infiltration, the so-called infiltration of Western values into China. So there's a very combative, very political and very strategic approach, that they have taken. I'm not one of those that believes, that the Chinese government was a good student of Joseph Nye. They developed a theory that counters what he put forth in Bound to Lead.
Now, it seems that there are two tracks that we should look at, and this is something that Cobus and I have been writing quite a bit about over the past 6 months in our newsletter, is that on the one hand, there's the governing elites. And you notice this when you just look, for example, last Sunday, CGTN did this China-Africa show where they invited ambassadors and various stakeholders. And when you hear the rhetoric from these ambassadors and these officials, they're retelling everything that you've just documented out to us, everything about the strategic narrative, all the things about how China-Africa cooperation is so beneficial. There is no daylight between the Chinese position and these governing elites. And it's the same on the continent, where we have, despite all of what we've seen in 2020, from Guangzhou all the way up to the loan issue through today and COVID-19, not a single president or prime minister has said anything critical of China. And that is a testament, and really the Chinese, I think, deserve credit for managing the soft power relationship with those governing elites. Now, is that coercive power or soft power? Okay, that's up for debate and dispute. Where there is no dispute is on the civil society side, particularly in democracies in Africa. I'm thinking mostly of South Africa, Kenya, Botswana, and Nigeria in particular, where public opinion is decidedly negative and getting worse, it seems like. Not just because of Guangzhou, but also because of the debt and also because of the way that the Chinese engage in Africa, which is a very top-down way, because when Guangzhou happened, the Chinese government apologized to the African Union, to ambassadors, and to foreign ministers, but never issued a public apology to people, to civil society. So I'm wondering, when you look at soft power in Africa or elsewhere around the world, what the Chinese are doing, do you also see those two tracks, or is it something different?
Actually, I agree with what you're saying, and I was speaking to a conference on this subject towards the end of last year, and just recently completed a study on it. And one of the things that I found is the heart of Chinese engagement is essentially governing elites, with which relationship building is extremely important. Intergenerational contact with leaderships, both in terms of political party leadership, as well as business elites that are connected to the governing parties, and military elites. So it's very, very state-driven. It's very top-down. So that is the one element, and I think that's one of the challenges of Chinese soft power, in the sense that it's very top-down. Now, having said that, the Chinese government has tried to it has broadened its engagement over the years. So, for instance, we see the scholarships, we see the local government training, we see the media training, we see the civil society, and even the legal side, where there's a lot of contact between the law commissions in China, as well as law bodies on the African continent. So sort of broadening that. But if you really interrogate those very, very carefully, they're still very much within the local regulations in terms of who benefits from these opportunities, who has the people that actually travel to China, for all these trainings. There is still a very state-to-state approach. So I think that's one of the problems. The other problem is perception. So at the beginning of the show, you were talking about some of the issues in Nigeria, and I can also talk about similar situations in Ghana. We've seen that in Zambia. We've seen it in Zimbabwe with state-owned enterprises and other countries as well. And I think a lot of it has to do with the private sector. Private sectors feeling edged out and feeling passed over in terms of the contracts that are construction contracts, contracts in power engineering and all that. Private sectors are feeling left out, particularly with regard to Belt and Road projects. Then the other element has to do with how African communities view China. Now, China is increasingly being seen as a superpower in its own right. Right, and so that immediately challenges the thesis that China is a fellow developing country that is sensitive to the needs of African countries, having been underdeveloped itself, having been colonized to some extent. There's that common understanding that China tries to build, but I think it's being blunted by the reality of the growth of Chinese power, and I think this is one of the major challenges that China faces, as it tries to build the kind of image that it has built on the continent since at least the 1960s.
Yeah, kind of going on from that point. As you say, China makes much of its kind of global South status in certain cases, and this idea of kind of South solidarity. Do you see that I guess, kind of just going on from your answer, like how much legs do you think that narrative still has in them? And is it possible for China in 20 years, for example, to still claim some form of self-solidarity, or will it have to be replaced by something else?
Well, I think that's a debate that is definitely taking place on the African continent, but it's also taking place in China itself, because there's by no means a monolithic approach. You've got different schools of thought within the soft power debate in China itself, that you see in academia, that you see in think tanks, as well as universities. There's a diversity of opinion, and I think one of the major challenges that you see being articulated when you look at the soft power discussions that are taking place in China itself is precisely how should China deal with this reality. The reality that, to a very large extent, you cannot call China a developing country in the strictest sense of the term. I mean, Africans see the wealth, they see the power dynamic. They're looking at the strategic competition right now that's taking place between China and the United States. They look at what's happening in the South China Sea. I mean, these are things that are being talked about on the African continent. And they're looking at the PLA. They pay a lot of attention to the military reforms that have happened. They pay a lot of attention to the growth of the Chinese military and its increasingly globalized role. So it's something that is definitely part of the discussion, and it would be interesting to see what direction the Communist Party takes. I mean, we have FOCA coming up next year. We have some critical milestones ahead of the next party congress. So we're going to have to see what direction the country takes, because this is becoming an increasingly difficult proposition to sell on the African continent.
Well, it's interesting you talked about the U.S.-China dispute, because in many ways Africa has said it wants to stay out of it. But what we're seeing is that Africa in so many ways is now caught in the middle, whether it wants to or not, either directly in the form of Naspers, which is the big digital tech company that owns the largest share of Tencent, and now its share price in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is fluctuating wildly based on what Donald Trump does to Chinese tech companies, whether it is the loan issue and on just the ongoing dispute between the two. So the Chinese are using various tools now in their soft power arsenal, much the same tools that all countries and major powers have to try and push back. So, of course, there is the state-run media, Xinhua, China Radio International, CGTN. Those are the obvious and visible tools of state power and soft power. Then they've got these digital distribution networks of content that are spread throughout African media. So you turn on Ghana Web, and all of a sudden there's Xinhua articles, independent online in South Africa, same way. They've got a strategic investment and quote-unquote partnership with the Chinese government. Those are, again, traditional tools of soft power. And I would like you to kind of separate, going back into the history that you are so expert in of Chinese, kind of the philosophy of soft power. How do the modern tools of soft power that the Chinese don't seem to be very good at? So the use of Twitter, they're not very good at. The CGTN, nobody really watches it, let's be honest with it. Those tools they're not very good at. But other tools in their arsenal they seem to be very, very good at. And these are the parts that I think in the US, in Europe, stakeholders don't seem to understand very well. Because when I meet with U.S. officials at the State Department, Defense Department, anywhere, they have this puzzled look on their faces to why is it that African countries like the Chinese so much and not us? They give you these very puzzled looks. Help us understand the differences in the tools that they use to enact their soft power in places like Africa.
You know, the more effective tools are precisely the ones that are more subtle and the ones that have grown incrementally over the years. And I think if you look at education and the role that China is playing in international education, I think that's one of the places to start, because it is very interesting to see that when you know, these scholarships, the scholarships that China offers to different African different African countries. If you look at the composition of the the beneficiaries of government scholarships, and then you look at the African students that go to China and are self-sponsored or go there through private means, I think that tells you something, because the numbers are growing quite significantly. When you look at the students that are there on self sponsorship, so that is one of the indicators that I think perhaps shows us that some of these soft power initiatives are succeeding. The other dimension is the training. Now, you now have a wide body of programs on offer in China, ranging from you've got a forum, a China Africa Journalist Forum, you have a China Africa legal and law reform forum, you have a China Africa Young Leaders Forum, you have a China Africa Youth Forum, you have all these different forums that China has in place. Some of them are short-term training. Others are long-term. So, for instance, if you look at the since 2014, they have hosted an 8-month fellowship program for journalists. Both from the state-run media and from private media as well. Right. So you are now beginning to see a shift from sort of the short to medium-term programs to the more long-term sort of fellowships, the sort of stuff that was mostly associated with countries like France, United States, United Kingdom, and Germany. So that is the one element. The other element is the training that takes place on the African continent. So we're increasingly starting to see a lot of the training that was initially on offer in China being moved to the African continent, and sort of trying to sort of indigenize that training, trying to do sort of like train the trainers initiatives in order to reach a much wider pool of beneficiaries. So I think if we look at the more subtle elements, and then of course you also have the still, looking at the subtle side, you do have soft power initiatives that are not necessarily happening at the behest of the government. So if you look at what's happening in the areas of agriculture, you look at what's happening with Chinese students on the African continent. You look at some of the research that's coming out with regard to the people-to-people ties that are happening outside of the state-to-state dimension. I think that's where the soft power initiatives are much more effective and much more subtle. And I think there's a gray area, and there's really a gap in research in terms of the soft power initiatives that are developing outside state and party direction. And I think that's where we need to be paying some attention to.
Cobus, it's interesting what Paul is saying because it's echoed a lot of what you've said over the years in terms of China's development story is its most compelling soft power initiative. This idea that in the space of 40 years, China went from being a country that in many cases was poorer than most African countries to the second largest economy in the world. Forget about everything else that roils the China-Africa relationship. That development story alone is very powerful. Do you still think that's relevant today?
Yes, I think so. I think it remains very relevant, and I think it's a narrative that unites this gap that we've discussed about between ruling elites and civil society. I think it plays positively in both. I mean, not without complications. I think it also sometimes. It's interesting for me, and I'd like to get Paul's take on this as well. But like, it's interesting for me how sometimes in discussion with Western commentators, especially American commentators, they assume a kind of high level of suspicion of entities like state-owned enterprises or kind of anything to do with the government. And I think that's different in Africa. Kind of Africa many African countries, national governments are big service providers, and so initiatives like Star Times, for example, rolling out cable TV or satellite TV then across large parts of rural Africa, and then kind of branding it as a kind of a China Nigeria or China Ghana kind of friendship gesture, kind of like bringing it from the corporate identity to the state identity, plays well, I think, in many parts of Africa. Paul, do you agree?
No, I agree. It does, and I think there are quite a number of commonalities that explain that. Definitely, when a company like Star Times, which is private, quote unquote, however, it does have this authorization from the Chinese government to roll this program out as part of FOCAC. The way it is received on the African continent would be a little bit different because, there's a sense that government is ultimately responsible, for things like service delivery, and there's that narrative that these are areas that the government is supposed to be involved with. So I think there's a very different perception in terms of the role of government in development and in things like media and to some extent soft power as well. So I think there's a different interpretation that somehow makes these initiatives there'll be some questions in terms of the role of the state, but African societies have a different conception of the role and responsibility of the state. That kind of brings us to a very, very interesting discussion of how to disconnect state-driven soft power initiatives and soft power initiatives that don't necessarily come from the state. So yes, I would agree with you that there are issues of perception there.
We have focused most of our discussion today, obviously, on what the Chinese are doing in Africa, but it's worthwhile to kind of put it in a broader context. And one of the things that I've struggled with is thinking about, say, the United States, who a lot of people assume that the U.S. government is good at soft power. So the idea is that in many ways, American culture is seen as the benchmark. First of all, the idea was coined by a Harvard professor. This is a concept that in the modern era has been framed by U.S. think tanks and policymakers. It's not been framed in the global South. So it's not surprising in some ways that Americans will naturally think that they are better or at least competent in soft power. And I'm wondering what you think, because when we look at American culture, it remains very strong still. People love Beyonce all over the world. That being said, here in Southeast Asia, I'll say American culture isn't as prominent, say, as Japanese and Korean culture. Nonetheless, that's a form of soft power as well, K-wave and K-pop and things like that. But my question is in terms of actual communicating government initiatives. The United States, for example, doesn't seem to be that compelling and doesn't seem to be that competent. And I'd be interested for you as somebody who sits in Washington and what your vantage point is in terms of comparing how the Chinese are in a place like Africa to how the U.S. is in Africa.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting question. No, I mean when you look at things from the American point of view, I would say that it's less an issue of government government sanctioned initiatives. I mean, of course, you have during the Cold War, you had Voice of America and all these other entities. But I mean, if you look at where do the next emerging African technologically savvy students, where do they think when they think about careers, when they think about where they want to be, say 5-10 years from now, and you ask those questions to an average African student, you're going to get a response. There'll be I want to go to MIT, or I want to go to Harvard, I want to go to to UPenn and so on and so forth. You won't hear them say, I want to go to Fudan University, or you won't hear that. So. And we can look at this in a number of other areas as well. So I think with American soft power, a lot of it has to do with how people perceive the United States, how people perceive the U.S. democracy, U.S. values, U.S. culture, are much more resilient, I would say, around the world, and precisely because essentially what Joseph Nye is saying, the extent to which outsiders or foreigners, outside audiences view your cultural attributes, your values, and so on and so forth. So that's what I would say. But looking at it from the Chinese side, you do have a couple of scholars like Wang Jise, for instance, who says that that ultimately soft power is not sanctioned, cannot be sustained over a long period if it is sanctioned by the state. It essentially has to be a bottom up. It has to be a bottom up process, and so there's a lot. There's a huge dimension of soft power that has to do with what is happening inside China itself. So you have scholars like him who have said that there's a domestic element to it as well.
But if that's the case, then, but I'm sorry to interrupt you, and Cobus brought this point up in our discussion about Guangzhou, where he pointed out that, and Cobus, forgive me for paraphrasing here and stop me if I'm wrong here, but on any given Tuesday, the level of discrimination against African migrants in the suburbs of Paris far exceeds whatever happened in Guangzhou. And yet, the outrage over Guangzhou was, orders of magnitude larger than what we've seen about anti-Black, anti-African migrant discrimination in France. And yet, here we are in the United States in 2020, where the White House, the government of the United States, is actively trying to disenfranchise Black voters. I mean, and the president is not even subtle about it. And yet, I mean, he's even admitting what he's trying to do. And they're taking mailboxes out of Black communities in order to make it more difficult for them to vote. We obviously have a police violence issue. There's so much in the U.S. culture that one would think would undermine what you're talking about in terms of the perceptions of the United States among Africans, and yet it remains durable. That doesn't make sense.
Would you like me to respond to that, or does Cobus want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question mixed with a statement mixed with a riddle that I'm confused about why you say that American soft power remains popular in a place like Africa, given what African migrants have had to do, the shutting off. I mean, we have S-hole countries. I mean, we don't have to go through the litany of what the Trump administration and even to some extent the Obama administration has done. But why is American soft power compelling to this day when in fact it's undergone so many challenges?
Right. I think it's there's that. If you look at the Afrobarometer reports, for instance, they do surveys, and in fact they have one that's coming out shortly, where they try to assess. I think they do it across 36 African countries in terms of development models and governance models that that respondents in these different African countries find attractive. And you see that the United States and China are really neck and neck in those assessments. And in some regions, the United States is seen as offering better better models than China than in others. So just judging by the sort of like some of that qualitative work, you do see that there is a level of resilience in terms of values that are associated with the American experiment and with essentially what America stands for. And I'm talking here. I'm talking about the broader dynamic and the broader perspective of what the United States and what America and Americans are seen to be representing on the continent and in other parts of the world. In terms of the backlash over what happened in Guangzhou earlier this year, I think the outpouring of anger, the outpouring of emotion over what happened to African communities there, I think the reason why it was so pronounced is precisely because it challenged or it questioned this narrative that has been taken for granted and that has really become embedded in the African discourse about what China represents on the African continent: a partner, a power that understands where Africa is coming from. Issues of poverty, lifting people out of poverty. Over 850 million have been lifted in a space of 40, 50 years. And sort of the narrative that China tries to promote within the FOCAC meetings and also its strategic communications of the continent. I think that was really challenged. It was challenged. And so the reason, the reason that the response was so sharp by African students and African communities, and even the African Union and governments on the continent and researchers on the continent, is precisely because it challenged this notion that that China will necessarily, given its history, behave and conduct itself differently from the quote unquote former colonial powers. So that's what I took away from the Guangzhou incident.
We've seen over the last year or so, officials on both the American and the Chinese sides being more comfortable to talk about, current U.S.-China tensions in terms of a new Cold War. That that concept has really become more prominent. What do you make of that? That way of talking becoming so prominent at the moment, and B, how do you see this kind of thing playing out over the next kind of near future in a place like Africa, and are we seeing a situation where there is more of a struggle for kind of public opinion in Africa, or how do you see that kind of open rivalry actually playing out in this kind of third space like in Africa?
Yes, no, I mean, just in terms of colleagues that I talk to on the continent, and sort of debates that I look at on this podcast and within the broader China-Africa community, there's a lot of pushback. And I think the reason why you have that pushback is because you have a generation of African professionals who do not believe that the continent should be a battleground for strategic competition between major powers. And the reason why this is so strongly, why African communities feel so strongly about this is because it immediately removes sort of the element of African agency. The African agency, both in terms of where should the continent be, and what are the continent's interests, and how should those interests be advanced. The problem with the strategic competition thesis, and I think it conjures images of the Cold War, is that the African story is completely ignored or overlooked. So I think there's a lot of pushback, and I think there are quite a number of there's a lot of research that's coming out, and a lot of statements that are being made outside. I'm talking outside of government circles, that are really challenging this notion, and are really putting on the table what the African development agenda should be, and what African interests should look like going forward. So that's the sense that I get, by talking and engaging with different colleagues within the Africa-China space.
Let's close our discussion looking forward, say the next 6 to 12 months, really the short term, because given what we're in right now in terms of the horrific year that 2020 is and what 2021 looks like it's going to be as well, it's hard to see beyond, that much beyond. It's like we're in the fog right now, so we have our fog lights on. Help us just get through the fog here. It doesn't look like the U.S.-China conflict is going to settle down anytime soon. It doesn't look like The delivery of any vaccine, if one comes, will come to Africa first, despite what the Chinese say. That's just speculation on my part. So it looks like the end of the year is going to be very, very difficult. And the narratives between the Chinese and the Americans is going to become more acidic. Africans will have to assert themselves in that space to articulate what it is that they want so they can assert agency, as you mentioned. What should we expect in this soft power space about the articulation of these various competing messages in the next 6 to 12 months?
Right. No, I think we're definitely going to see an intensification of Chinese soft power initiatives on the continent, and sort of going up to the FOCAC meeting in Senegal. We're going to see a lot more of that because at a larger strategic level, the competition and the rivalry is intensifying. So you're going to see Beijing really doubling down on its soft power initiatives, and it would be interesting to see what new initiatives will be announced at the next FOCAC round. Secondly, I think there's going to be much more debate on the African continent on China-Africa relations, what the relationship should look like, and how African countries should engage, not just China, but other development partners. I think one of the things that I'm really encouraged, I think which is really, really encouraging, is the China-Africa independent community of researchers and scholars are really asserting themselves and really inserting themselves in these discussions, in the policy discussions. So, for instance, if you look at the issues around accountability, if you look at the issues around transparency, Kenya is a very good example where the discourse on accountability of Chinese projects around you look at what happened with the SGR. A lot of that is coming from these communities of interest. You look at what's happening in Ghana. You look at what is happening even in South Africa. I think there is a growth of commentary that I think is very noteworthy in terms of trying to assert that African agency. So this is where I think things are heading. I think we're going to see more intensified engagement, but at the same time, you're going to see a lot more African actors inserting themselves in that debate and trying to assert African agency, which I think is a good thing.
Paul Nantulya is a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Your insights were just really so helpful to let me understand what's going on, and I'm sure the audience enjoyed it as well. Tell us, you are on Twitter, and what is your handle so people can follow what you're reading and writing these days?
My handle is P Nantulya. Very, very simple.
Great. Well, I'll put a link to Paul's Twitter link in the show notes down below, also to some of his recent writings. Paul is very, very active on the China-Africa research circuit. You'll see his writings out there. He's very, very vocal in the community and just always a fascinating voice, and we're just honored to have you on the show today. So thank you so much for taking the time and getting up so early to join us. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And it was excellent to connect. And Cobus, really, really honored to share this space with you.
Cobus, when I give talks on China-Africa relations, I often say that I'm going to leave people more confused than when they started, because this is a story that doesn't kind of have a neat, clean narrative. And I have to admit that I'm more confused now than when we started a discussion with Paul. And that's actually a good thing, because it means that there's a lot more nuance and texture coming into the conversation. I'm generally very skeptical of Chinese soft power initiatives in Africa because I think they're not very good. But at the same time, I'm also now starting to realize that I may not be looking at it the right way, that they are, again, using tools that I don't fully understand. I may be just looking at the superficial part, which is Twitter, CGTN, embassy messaging, the traditional tools of soft power. But what they're doing behind the scenes, the things that Lina Ben Abdallah from Wake Forest University detailed in her book about the relationships, the knowledge sharing, that's what Paul brought up. That may be where the secret sauce of Chinese soft power is. And the fact that civil society doesn't like the Chinese, The fact that the Premium Times newspaper in Nigeria or Daily Maverick or Daily Nation in Kenya, writes these editorials that are blasting the Chinese, maybe the Chinese don't care about that. Maybe that's just not important. I don't know. I mean, it probably is at some level, but the priority for them is on that governing elite and the political side, and maybe the civil society side is something that they recognize that no government today is good at soft power on the civil society side. I don't think there's a single government out there that can manage Facebook messaging in a country like Nigeria and trying to get public opinion to switch because it's too large, too expensive, too complicated, and they don't have the expertise to manage those types of messages in this very fractured media landscape. Maybe the Chinese get that, and they're just concentrating on those governing elites, which they seem to be doing pretty well, as Paul pointed out. What do you think?
It's a bunch of different things. But I guess one thing is one should make a distinction between soft power as an ongoing entity and the different kind of public diplomacy tools that are used to try and build it. So CGTN or Twitter or all of these different things are different public diplomacy tools. And the soft power is frequently, this is what makes it such a complicated concept because it is so nebulous and it accumulates over a long time. So one of the questions I think to ask about, say, US soft power in Africa is to which extent we're seeing current US soft power and to which extent we're seeing the accumulation of many decades of US cultural power. So that's
and the US ideal,
exactly
that US, not necessarily grounded in the contemporary reality, but the ideal of what the United States stands for or used to stand for.
I think also, another thing that I think is interesting to think about is in lots of cases, I think the US is a really important example of this, in the sense that the US is part of the US's power in a place like Africa is that it has a kind of a weight and a history that kind of creates its own reality. So in the sense that you mentioned all of these issues around race in the US and the way that it plays out in Africa, but we should also, I think, keep in mind that there's so many of the tools of anti-racist activism, so many of the kind of phrases, the kinds of language that's used, Black Lives Matter being the most prominent example, also come from the US. So the US both is, kind of has this race problem, but then its solutions to its race problem or its ways of being active against this kind of oppression is also a form of American export. So that it has, the US has this kind of size where it encompasses both of those things at the same time and even more. So it kind of creates its own reality. And I think China has not grown to that level, not in Africa anyway.
No, I mean, there's no Kamala Harris in China. There's no Barack Obama in China, and there never will be. And the idea that someone from a minority population can rise to become the vice president or the president or even the head of a corporation, whatever, is a promise and a dream that the United States delivers on enough to make it a reality, whereas China simply doesn't offer that.
Yeah. I think the one thing I agree with Paul. The one thing that we should really keep an eye on is the development of the development discourse. Because that really is something that I think that really lies at the heart not only of the China-Africa relationship, but also why the China-Africa relationship is important for the West, because China brings the story of we were very poor and we lifted all these people out of poverty, and that is a valuable story. But in the kind of triangular context, the story has another kind of important kind of side kind of aspect to it, which is not only that you are currently poor and you could be as rich as we are, but you are currently poor because of the West. The West was directly the reason for your current poverty. And that obviously is a weak spot in China and in Africa-West relations, which is never going to go away because it's fundamental to what the relationship is. And I think there is really something to look at in relation to China and Africa.
But isn't that exactly what U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is saying about the debt trap, that you are going to be crushed by Chinese loans, so you are going to be poor and poorer for dealing with the Chinese? So in some ways, both are saying that about the other.
Yeah, no, they are, and but the story is lopsided in the sense that no matter what kind of bad things you say about the Chinese, the one thing China didn't do is colonize Africa for 500 years. That history sits there. No, that history is not going away, no matter what you say about China. And sure, China might be bad in the future, but the future is undecided. The past is decided. So I think that's where the difference lies.
And so much of our discussion today focused on state soft power, and we alluded to it a little bit with our discussion on Star Times, but I think we're understating the importance of the technology soft power. So brands like Huawei, Boomplay, Star Times, Transsion, Techno, all of these Chinese tech brands, I think, are incredibly important. Now TikTok's starting to come to the continent. There's so many different tech brands that young people are speaking to. And then we didn't mention Jack Ma and what he's doing in terms of speaking about entrepreneurialism and the competition that he's got and the netrepreneurs concept. So this private sector soft power is rising very, very quickly. And in so many ways, it's speaking to African youth who do not want to hear about aid. They don't want to hear about charity. They don't want to hear about safaris or starving babies or anything of the popular narratives in the US and Europe. Instead, Jack Ma is coming in and saying, we want to talk about startups and technology and entrepreneurialism and building your own business and charting your own course. That's a very empowering message. So it's not a state message, but nonetheless, it's a Chinese message. And I think that Chinese entrepreneurialism that is innate in the culture is something that is going to be a very powerful force in the future.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because entrepreneurialism is incredibly popular in Africa. It has a very, very good image, which seems like a kind of redundant thing to say. But I was at a few years ago. I was on a panel judging, or kind of helping to advise on which South African students should get Japanese government scholarships to study in Japan. And all of these kids came in and said, I want to study engineering. I want to study engineering at a Japanese university and then come back and start a business. And that is, that is a platinum grade South African story of aspiration and success. But it was interesting that the Japanese government officials they didn't like that. They wanted someone who could come back and strengthen the government or strengthen the system, not being in it for, quote, private gain. And that was a very interesting kind of it was revealing for me about how Africa sees entrepreneurialism. It's incredibly bullish on entrepreneurialism. And so I think in that sense, there's a real overlap there between Africa and China.
We are hashing out these issues every single day in our newsletter and on our website. We'd love for you to become a member of the China Africa Project. We start subscriptions at $7 a month for students, $15 a month for everybody else. It's a great bargain. You get a daily email newsletter from Cobus and I with all of this information. I mean, it is packed full of analysis and news, and there's really no one else out there that is doing this kind of daily intelligence brief on all that's going on in economics, politics, soft power, culture, technology, all of those different things. And so also you get access to our expert network with people like Paul, who's in our network. He's a member there. And then, of course, all the archives of 10 years of podcasts and all the writing that we're doing. So go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. If you use the promo code podcast, we'll take $50 off the price on an annual subscription. So that's a great deal. By the way, we're going to be wrapping that up very soon. So if you want to take advantage of that offer, it is August, in late August that we're doing that. Come September, we're going to be stopping that promotion. So take advantage of that now if you can. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. If you ever want to reach Cobus or I, super easy to find us. Eric at ChinaAfricaProject.com is my email address. Cobus is at ChinaAfricaProject.com. That's COBUS at ChinaAfricaProject.com. Go ahead and send us an email. We write back pretty quickly usually, and sometimes you get a really long message from me because I love talking about China-Africa news and things like that and interacting with listeners. So please do reach out and say hello. So that'll do it. We'll be back again next week with another show. For Cobus Venstaden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, or you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China and Africa email newsletter by going to www.chinaafricaproject.com.